Recognizes Mr. Casten for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. I must say, there's a part of this whole hearing that makes me very sad. And it makes me sad because pre-COVID, I think the three biggest days for single day above baseline mortality events in the United States were 9/11 at nearly 3,000 people, Hurricane Katrina at 1,800, and the number three was the 1995 Chicago heat wave that killed 700 people. And so much of what Dr. Shondas was talking about, what makes me sad is that this isn't new, right? In 1995, the people who died were the least among us. It was people who couldn't afford air conditioning, people who didn't have social networks checking in on them. Since that time, inequality has increased. Since 1991, we've emitted 50% of all the CO2 we have ever emitted as a species since we first learned how to make a fire 1 million years ago. And, we're talking a good game, but at some point, future generations are going to watch our feet and ask if we moved. And I'm sorry to be sad and bring us down, but I'm sad. Dr. Shondas, I want to maybe use that to riff a little bit to you. There's University of Chicago, the EPIC Energy Policy Institute, has done this really interesting work that I'm sure you're familiar with on the social cost of carbon and how these things change regionally. And as you have looked around to see where these inequities exist, where the costs are, there are some of the costs that are functions of social policy questions. Where do we plant trees? What do we do for building codes? And we can fix those legislatively. There's some of those costs that are just geographical. There's a reason we don't build cities in Death Valley. There's a reason we don't zone homes on floodplains. And as temperatures rise in areas to Death Valley levels, as flooding gets more common, some of these issues are only solved by relocation. As you've looked at your data, following up on what Congresswoman Bonamici asked about sort of the hyperlocal questions, have you thought at all about how to quantify to what degree are the solutions we should be thinking about social questions? And to what degree do we need to be? Is it more cost effective to think about providing people with opportunities to relocate?
Yes. So the extent to which we've looked at this, relocation has been really brought up a lot around sea level rise and managed retreat discussions that are active in the literature. And we have yet to see those implemented in any substantial way in any parts of the country. We've heard proposals with various indigenous tribes, for example, in the Northwest, like the Queets community in Northwestern Washington, that are considering retreating from that particular Pacific coastal zone. But in terms of heat, the main discussions that have been happening is really around the social policy and around the potential interventions that could be effective. Right now, we have a lot of modeling data about what specific interventions might ameliorate temperatures at the city block level or even at the district level, neighborhood level, yet we don't have very much empirical evidence on that right now. We're embarking on a project with the Urban Land Institute to actually look at, for example, buildings that are being designed and developed and monitoring those in such a way to see whether there's specific things like green roofs, green walls, whether there's blue-green or water features, whether there's specific geometries or configurations of that building that could actually ameliorate temperatures, and study that empirically. So we are embarking upon that right now. There are some really off-the-shelf things, like we've already heard from Dr. Guadaro and others about green infrastructure as being a really important first step to this, to achieving this. So the social policy questions are really at the core of it, and whether communities are really taking a step into this will really depend on what federal government guidance is given. I'm
sorry, I want to just interrupt because I want to get one more question for Dr. Bernstein, but I do just want to point out that a lot of the areas that you see this are areas where, because of redlining, it's concentrated. So there is a reverse redlining question at some level. Dr. Bernstein, you mentioned some of the issues around things less than death, increased workplace fatality. We had Dr. Ji-Sung Park testify to exactly this issue on the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis earlier this week, and how they're starting to see some evidence of increased, OSHA issues at rising heat. Any quick comments in the little time we've got left on areas for further research on that front?
Sure. We need to very much understand, much more so for rural areas than we do urban areas. Most of the data we have is in urban areas. We need to focus on the ties between the economic effects. So we see the impairments in economic productivity, the losses in GDP, and as a result of heat. And those get compounded by individual effects from heat. So the same places where the economy is getting hit by heat, we see compounded effects upon individuals. But critically, again, we need to focus on understanding what we can do to mitigate heat. And Representative Casten, I also would underscore that it's hard to have this conversation and talking about all we can do to essentially adapt to heat when it's very clear that the single best thing we can do to address all of the above is to prevent greenhouse gas emissions in the first place. That'll be far more effective than hyperlocalized data. It'll be far more effective than me writing prescriptions or telling people how to stay out of heat from both
I'm afraid the gentleman's time has expired.
Here, and I yield back.
Thank you. And next, I'd like to recognize Mr. Chris for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thanks to all the witnesses for being with us today. In cities across the country, the summer of 21